Hello and welcome to this episode of the Federalist Files. I'm going to be going over Federalist number 24. It's going to be titled The Powers Necessary to the Common Defense Further Considered, written by Alexander Hamilton, December 19th, 1787. Topics include funding of military regulated by the legislature to defend against encroachments, as well as first mention of an actual constitutional militia and military as well. So I just want to start by saying Merry Christmas to everybody, or I hope you had a Merry Christmas. This will be releasing on Friday. It's pre-recorded. It's going to be released Christmas Day, probably around maybe 6 o'clock. I might actually release it earlier. It would make more sense because people are home, not really celebrating Christmas, I guess. So it'll take a while for people to get to it, but I hope everyone has a great Merry Christmas. Enjoy the holiday. Take time to hang out with your family. Don't listen to what the health officials tell you to do, and don't listen to them and saying don't go see your family. Don't go do anything. Govern yourself the best that you see fit. So Hamilton in this paper, he defends the federal government's power in respect to the creation and direction of the national forces and answers the criticism in relation to standing armies in times of peace. He states, and mostly this entire paper, it's going to be just talking about the militia, standing militaries. There's a couple papers written about standing militaries because Hamilton is fighting tooth and nail, vehemently opposed to his dissenters in terms of a standing military or a limitless military support. So this is kind of an introduction to that. He's constantly fighting them on this one especially. He finds it very imperative. So he states, and I quote, "I have met with but one specific objection, which, if I understand it right, is this, that proper provision has not been made against the existence of standing armies in times of peace, an objection which I shall now endeavor to show rests on weak and unsubstantial foundations." End quote. So he's saying pretty much dissenters, objectors to the proposed constitution, saying it's tyrannical to have a standing army, standing military in times of peace. And he finds this objection erroneous and it has a weak foundation, and he is going to show and exploit all of the problems with that argument in this paper. So then he continues, and I quote, "It has indeed been brought forward in the most vague and general form, supported only by bold assertions, without the appearance of argument, without even the sanction of theoretical opinions, in contradiction to the practice of other free nations and to the general sense of America as expressed in most of the existing constitutions. The propriety of this remark will appear the moment it is recollected that the objection under consideration turns upon a supposed necessity of restraining the legislative authority of the nation in the article of military establishments, a principle unheard of except in one or two of our state constitutions and rejected in all the rest." End quote. So hear what he's saying, and he gets pretty deep in here. There's two states, so all the state constitutions at this time, there was only two of them, and I have an article here, I'm trying to find it, the two states that didn't have standing militaries. He's talking about North Carolina and Pennsylvania, their two state constitutions. It read, "As standing armies in time of peace are dangerous to liberty, they ought not to be kept up." So those two states, they did not like it seems not even like it sounds more like a caution than an actual prohibition of it, which is kind of weird. But then every other state, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Delaware, and Maryland, all have standing armies are dangerous to liberty and ought not to be raised or kept up without the consent of the legislature, which is what the provision in the Constitution will be, and that's what he is going to propose as the remedy for having the idea of a standing military or standing army, is that it is up to the consent of the legislature. The legislature is supposed to represent the people at large, so thus the legislature wouldn't, in theory, the legislature would not vote against what the people see as sufficient. And then there was other states, I think they had, I want to say it was, here we go, New York had no Bill of Rights. They didn't even talk about this at all in their state constitution. There was a lot of differences in a lot of these state constitutions. Apparently, Massachusetts was the one that was the Massachusetts Constitution was used as the format for the actual federal constitution that we have today. They took a lot of principles and elements of that constitution and they put it in the federal constitution that we have today, including, I'm pretty sure Massachusetts was the reason for the Bill of Rights as well. So then, what else? Oh yeah, it's going to be left up to the legislative authority, and Hamilton uses this argument because the dissenters are a fan of the current system. The current system generally kind of just has a council, more like a Congress assembled, they called it. I've mentioned this before. And they were much more of a fan of a hands-off federal government, but having that legislative system of that Congress. So he's kind of using the argument of his objectors to argue against them. He's turning it right back around on them. Now, critics vested this whole power in the arms of an executive branch, which in turn can lead to a despotism. Hamilton answers those criticisms with a balanced power. And then he also mentions that this isn't going to be laid. The idea of there's certain powers as the executive branch, as the president would have. He's the commander-in-chief, as they call it. They direct military operations. I think they decide what the money that is given to appropriated for the military. They decide at their discretion what it's going to be used on. That's the executive branch. But the executive branch does not appropriate the funding to begin with. That is of the legislative nature. That is of the House of Representatives in particular. They are the ones that write the budget every single 2 years. They approve the budget. It goes to the Senate. Senate has to vote. And then I think it gets to the president's desk. President has to vote it, or he can veto it, dependent on what he thinks is necessary. So particularly, there's no guarantee of a military despotism through the president, because every 2 years they can be completely defunded by the legislative branch if the executive is acting in dereliction of their duty. So then he continues, and I quote, "A stranger to our politics who was to read our newspapers at the present juncture without having previously inspected the plan reported by the convention would be naturally led to one of two conclusions: either that it contained a positive injunction that standing armies should be kept up in time of peace, or that it vested in the executive the whole power of levying troops without subjecting his discretion in any shape to the control of the legislature." End quote. So here what he's saying: if some random person that wasn't familiar with our politics at all, somebody, let's say they came from Britain, and they go to open up one of the newspapers in the present juncture, is what he says. If they were to open one of our, and it kind of does relate to today, because our current media is malfeasant in their behavior. They are purposely suppressing stories, not get out there, such as any type of voter fraud information. They don't even want it to get out there. They just keep saying it's baseless because court systems won't take it up. Court systems using discretion not to take up voter fraud cases does not invalidate voter fraud cases. It just means that you have a bunch of spineless people working in the court system. It does not take away or diminish any affidavits or testimonial or evidence of voter fraud. It just says that the court doesn't see it within their purview, or they are spineless and gutless, essentially. So he's saying anybody that goes and reads these newspapers in America, the way the press is covering the proposed Constitution, they would be led to either two conclusions: that the military and funding of the military and the whole power of levying the troops, raising the troops, keeping the troops, the entire power is exclusively to the executive branch, which isn't true. And in any shape. And then he continues, and he continues on this same note, talking about the person that was to come here. If they were to read our newspapers, they would think this. And then he continues on this, and he states, "If he came afterwards to peruse the plan itself, he would be surprised to discover that neither the one nor the other case was the case. That the whole power of raising armies was lodged in the legislature, not in the executive. That this legislature was to be a popular body consisting of representatives of the people periodically elected." End quote. So periodically elected House of Representatives every single 2 years. You're going to have very short. So And the reason for that is this exact reason here. It pertains to the funding, the appropriating of funds. So if you have, let's say, a couple House of Representative members that are teaming up with the president to build up the military, if they wanted to do this, if they wanted to get full tyrannical, authoritarian on the people, and they were colluding with each other, conspiring against the people, then after 2 years you can vote those people out easily. So there's much more skin in the game for House of Representative members. They have to really follow what their constituents are telling them to do and say, more than a senator, because a senator, is only in their they have a longer term of 6 years, and then the president has his 4-year term. So that's really what he's saying. So, and also, obviously, I've mentioned this before, the House of Representatives are the most representative of the people out of all of and the reason for that was the way in which the senators were elected through the state legislatures rather than the people at large voting for them. So they weren't as direct of a representative as the House of Representatives are. They are truly and naturally the most representative of the people, much more than the senators were at this time. Now the senators kind of, it's kind of wishy-washy. It's the same voting habits, so it's kind of representative of the people, but it's not the same as it used to be. Now, as a natural defense against military despotism, Hamilton has laid out the provision of a new appropriation of the government budget every 2 years, which is strictly laid at the legislative discretion. Those legislators, additionally, are entrusted with the will of the people and will be elected with great propriety to follow that trust. Now, he continues on this note talking about the same thing about this guy, if he were to come here from another country and read a newspaper. And then he states, and I quote, "Instead of the provision he had supposed in favor of standing armies, there was to be found in respect to this object an important qualification even of the legislative discretion in that cause which forbids the appropriation of money for the support of an army for any longer period than 2 years, a precaution which, upon a nearer view of it, will appear to be a great and real security against the keeping of troops without evident necessity." Meaning, in other words, you will not be holding and keeping troops unless if there's evidence that is completely necessary of doing so. Your military spending won't be completely blown out unless if we see a direct threat coming at us. And if the case ever arises where if you suddenly, and this is, let's say you just passed, for example, let's say you just passed the budget, which I think they just passed. This new stimulus package along with the budget, I believe, was just passed. Now the stimulus, $900 billion. I don't remember the exact math. Maybe I'll cover it in one of my current event episodes, but for how many families we have in the nation, I want to say it's something like 183 million. If you do the math on 900 billion, and if you were to just divide that by every single family in the United States, it would come out to something, I want to say, like $7,000, but somehow everyone's only getting a $600 check. It's very inconsistent because the money is going to a bunch of other things, but people like to think that it's going to the people. It's really not. It's going to a bunch of bureaucrat garbage. It goes to individual state governments sometimes. It'll go to local governments, passed down from the state governments. So every single time we pass any of these, what they call is a relief, this one's called a relief bill rather than a stimulus bills. It's not meant to stimulate the economy. This one's just to keep us teetering, keep us going, I guess. I don't really understand the difference because any of these bills, the government can never actually stimulate the economy because they are a net loser. Having government in our lives, they are a net loser for the people. They do not make any money. They are not self-perpetuating, meaning they're not bringing in any type of revenue that they're actually earning. They are not a value added to the economy. So all they do is take, and then when they actually distribute that money back out to the people, it's really them just taking our money and funneling it back to us. And it's the classic leaky bucket. You put the water in the bucket and then you hand it off to the person next to you, and look, now suddenly there's all that money lost that was used up by the government, and that's what ends up happening with a lot of these stimulus packages. A lot of money gets lost in translation. It's kind of sketchy what goes on in the federal government with any type of stimulus or relief bill. What they should be doing is they should be passing things that are straight into the pockets of Americans. What we should do is we should divide by how many families, and the money should just be distributed fairly that way across the board instead of doing what we do. $600 after so many months. People needed this. They needed this relief, and this is what they got: $600, which is really not much. So, yeah. So what I have next is, and that was the point that I was going to make. So now that they just passed the budget, right? Let's say China decides to attack us like 2 months from now, and we go, oh, our military only has $700 billion in the bank. We're not going to be able to afford this war. That's completely fine, because then we can have our legislative branch call for more funding, just like they did in this relief package. That's the reason. It all comes back around. That was my reasoning for referring to the relief package, is that as they see fit, the legislative branch can attempt to appropriate funds whenever it is considered necessary for them. They have much more power, the legislative branch. That's why people like to point at the president and blame the president for everything. Whether it's a Democrat or Republican, at the end of the day, the Senate not the Senate, the Congress, both chambers of the Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives, they really do hold ultimately a lot of the power in our federal government system, because they hold the purse in the House of Representatives. And then the Senate holds a lot of these confirmations in terms of the third branch, our judicial branch. They hold confirmations themselves. They vote to confirm people in the judiciary, as well as cabinet. I think not cabinet members, but ambassadors, certain government officials also they have to vote through. So they hold a lot of power in our government as well. And per person, they hold more power because there's less of them than there is the House of Representatives. But at the end of the day, the legislative branch really, they do have the ultimate power if they were ever actually unified on anything. And that was the point, is that the founders did not want them to be unified on anything. They wanted to be overwhelming support to make an amendment. They wanted overwhelming support to pass any type of law, because they didn't believe that government intervention was a good thing. And there is certain, in the future, I will reference this in a couple different papers, when they say laws that are made for a small percentage of people most likely are not good laws to begin with, such as the pre-existing condition clause in Obamacare, such as things like that. So Hamilton continues, and I quote, "If under this impression he proceeded to pass in review the several state constitutions, how great would be his disappointment to find that two only of them contained an interdiction of standing armies in time of peace, that the other 11 had either observed a profound silence on the subject, or had in express terms admitted the right of the legislature to authorize their existence." So that's the same him just going over again that there's 2 states that actually are against standing militaries. Other than that, every other state has either nothing said on the subject, or they are in favor of them as long as it is regulated by the legislative branch. And then he continues, and I quote, "It would probably occur to him that he would be likely to find the precautions he was in search of in the primitive compact between the states. Here at length he would expect to meet with a solution of the enigma. No doubt he would observe to himself the existing confederation must contain the most explicit provisions against military establishments in times of peace, and a departure from this model in a favorite point has occasioned the discontent which appears to influence these political champions," end quote. So here actually he's ripping the Articles of Confederation. He's saying this individual, after reading the newspapers in America, you would think, after reading about how bad the Constitution is because it allows standing militaries by legislative discretion, that the old system, the Articles of Confederation, or the current system in place, would have explicit provisions against military establishments during times of peace. And then he's going to continue on this note. And I quote, "If he should now apply himself to a careful and critical survey of the Articles of Confederation, his astonishment would not only be increased, but would acquire a mixture of indignation at the unexpected discovery that these articles, instead of containing the prohibition he looked for, and though they had with jealous circumspection restricted the authority of the state legislatures in this particular, had not imposed a single restraint on that of the United States," end quote. So what he's saying, Articles of Confederation, they had their rights for requisitions and quotas, and there was no type of restraint in the Articles of Confederation against military establishments. It was as, I guess, that Congress assembled saw fit. They really held all the power in that regard. There was no executive branch with a qualified negative, such as a veto power to stop them, or a judiciary to look at what they're doing and saying, oh, well, this is against the Constitution, or this is against the governing document. You guys cannot do this. There was nothing, there was no type of safeguard in the Articles of Confederation. Therefore, Hamilton's really just, he's extolling the Constitution. He's saying, oh, you would think, based on what these papers say, this Constitution's so terrible and we have these military establishments at legislative discretion, you would think that the Articles of Confederation would have specific articles or specific provisions prohibiting these standing militaries, and it doesn't. It doesn't have anything. It actually has more power than is enshrined in the Constitution. So then he follows up with a contention from those critics of the proposed Constitution. He summarizes the power of the Congress under the Articles of Confederation, where there is no limit to military power that can be assembled and delineated by the current government, like I just said. Now, Hamilton charges contenders with, and I quote, an intention to mislead the people by alarming their passions rather than to convince them by arguments addressed to their understandings, end quote. It's actually, it relates to today. Like I said, you have the mainstream media, legacy media types. They're painting a narrative. They're contriving a narrative to the American people of what is going on when it's really not the truth. And most people, like I've said this before, a lot of people, they live their lives free of politics. They don't really care for it. They're more inspired by watching sports, watching football, watching reality television shows. They don't, after a long day of work, they do not feel like looking at the politics. They have learned so much already in their regular work day, or they have already expended all of their energy, that they don't feel like now going and turning on the television to Fox News, CNN, or MSNBC. And the same thing goes for turning on or listening to a podcast, or doing any type, or reading, or doing anything like that. So the first thing they see is the mainstream media. Even on Google, they will change your search results when you go to Google something. They will write into the algorithm ways in which to suppress conservative content, and then they'll exalt liberal content. It is the same thing when you turn on all media, with the exception of probably Fox News, that's more mainstream on TV, is of the left. Fox News really is not even that far to the right. Just the opinion people at night are. The people during the day are more moderate left-wingers. So when it's everywhere and it's perpetuated consistently, everywhere, persistently, people that are unaware and really don't care. And also then there's the memes that get circulated all through the internet, and then the fact checks only come from the conservative side. For the conservatives, fact checks never fact check liberals. I actually saw one the other day, so I'll correct myself. I saw one, I don't even remember what it was, but I was like, wow, look at this, is a fact checked on a liberal source. It's like the first time I've ever seen this before in my life. But usually it does not happen. That is much more of the nature or the propensity to shut down the right-wing voices and suppress or fact-check them with authoritative, meaning subjective sources, source data or materials. But so you see this in our media today, so it's not really surprising that this was going on in 1787. It's just funny that it's just things change over time, technology gets more advanced, but it seems like the Homo sapiens mindset and the way in which they live their lives, and the mishaps and the disadvantages, the bad parts, the bad elements, the flaws of human nature continue to present themselves throughout history, no matter how much technology has come out. And we've seen this. We've seen Ralph Northam. They tore down a Robert E. Lee statue in Virginia, and Ralph Northam, I don't know why it's so hard to say his name, Ralph Blackface Northam, if anyone that's unfamiliar, is the governor that came out saying that we kill babies after they're born out of the womb. We go and make a decision with the doctor because the woman did. If an abortion gets botched and the baby's actually born alive and it's a healthy baby, then the mother and the doctor go make a decision in the back room about what to do with the child. That same governor, and then a couple weeks later, he ends up getting caught years ago when he was in high school or college. He dressed up in blackface, and his one friend dressed up in the KKK outfit, or it was the other way around. He wasn't sure. He doesn't remember. I just think it's convenient as soon as he comes out and actually tells everybody the silent part out loud about how he's like totally pro-abortion after death. I mean, after birth, like the baby's already born and we're still going to kill the child at this point. He's pro that. He doesn't care. He says the silent part out loud. He says the Democrat platform out loud. Then suddenly now all these pictures emerge of him. Suddenly out of the blue, as if this wasn't a DNC hit job to get him out of office because he damaged them so much in what he said. So yeah, you see he puts that up about taking down this Robert E. Lee statue, and he's bragging about it, he's boasting about it, and it's just funny because you have a guy, Robert E. Lee, he was a general, he's one of the best generals in American history. Now, what he was fighting for was not a good or noble cause. But then you have another guy that's tearing down a statue, bragging about himself doing it, and the other guy's no better. I would actually say that Robert E. Lee may have been a person of more rectitude and integrity than a Ralph Northam was, than not Ralph Northam is currently. So we still have that going on. We have human nature stays the same. It seems like over time there's always going to be some sort of sleazebaggery perpetuating. No matter what time it is, no matter how much the technology changes, and then we're now holding ourselves to this standard, what is going on in society now, as that's the standard in which should have been followed 800 years ago, and it just doesn't really, it's nonsensical, and it's really not sensible to those times. So if you go back in, let's say 500 years of slavery across the world, so we're going to tear down every single person that had a slave or practiced slavery or did not even speak against slavery because now today we don't believe in it. It's kind of weird to now take what's going on today and apply it to something that happened knowing all the things that we know now technologically, all the information that we have at our fingertips, to take it and then apply it to people 500 years ago. It doesn't really make any sense. But yeah, so next he goes on to state, and I quote, "From a close examination, it will appear that restraints upon the discretion of the legislature in respect to military establishments in time of peace would be improper to be imposed, and if imposed, from the necessities of society would be unlikely to be observed," end quote. So he's saying if this was proposed, this be an unrealistic policy, kind of like, I think it was the Danish Republic I was talking about, where they needed a unanimous vote. And because of that, it was never followed, the Constitution, in exigent circumstances, in very tumultuous or chaotic times. This Constitution was not followed because you needed unanimity in the vote, and that just was not possible. It wasn't practical to have it set up that way. And that's what he's saying here is if we had a society set up where there is no legislative discretion upon military establishments, then we are going to violate that eventually, just because it's so unlikely with countries trying to maybe invade. He talks about this next, actually, so I'll get to it next. Hamilton explains the need for military establishments in time of peace, and he states, and I quote, "Though a wide ocean separates the United States from Europe, yet there are various considerations that warn us against an excess of confidence or security," end quote. Now, Hamilton, then he goes on to cite Britain, Spain, native tribes, and France as national security threats, even though they were in good relationship with France and Spain. I'm going to explain this, but I'm going to state the quote first. On one side of us, and stretching far into our rear, are growing settlements subject to the dominion of Britain. On the other side, and extending to meet the British settlements, are colonies and establishments subject to the dominion of Spain. This situation in the vicinity of the West India Islands belonging to these two powers create between them, in respect to their American possessions, and in relation to us, a common interest. The savage tribes on our western frontier ought to be regarded as our natural enemies, their natural allies, because they have most to fear from us and most to hope from them. End quote. So saying the Native Americans, Native tribes had the most to fear from America and the most hope from them, meaning the most hope for Britain and Spain. So Spain at this time, they owned Florida and some of the West Indian Islands in the south of Florida, as well as Britain owned some of those islands. So that's what he's referring to there, talking about the establishments. And then he continues, and I quote, "The improvements in the art of navigation have, as to the facility of communication, rendered distant nations in a great measure neighbors. Britain and Spain are among the principal maritime powers of Europe. A future concert of views between these nations ought not to be regarded as improbable. The increasing remoteness of consanguinity is every day diminishing the force of the family compact between France and Spain." So what he's saying when he says the word I'm having issues with here, consanguinity, he's saying ties in blood. So even though we are related to people that live in France and Spain, there are a lot of French and Spanish people that live in the United States at this point. Now they consider themselves Americans. And the same thing with all of Europe in general. America was derived and was comprised of a lot of Europeans, settlers. So he's saying that tie of blood is diminishing by our remoteness, our closeness to the European countries that have these strong maritime powers meaning a strong navy that can get here very quickly and can battle us on our eastern seaboard. So Hamilton details, and I quote, "Politicians have ever with great reason considered the ties of blood as feeble and precarious links of political connection." So he's just referring to that consanguinity that I was talking about before, ties of blood, how they're in politics, it's not really a strong connection. It's meaningless. This paper is the first citation of the militia in relation to their work as security on the western frontier, in which Hamilton describes, and I quote, "Previous to the Revolution and ever since the peace, there has been a constant necessity for keeping small garrisons on our western frontier. No person can doubt that these will continue to be indispensable, if it should only be against the ravages and depredations of the Indians. These garrisons must either be furnished by occasional detachment from the militia or by permanent corps in the pay of the government." So what he's saying here is, he's talking about garrisons. When he says garrisons, he's talking about the troops that are stationed, I guess you would call them like fortresses or I guess military encampments, to defend different towns and different areas, different territories. So you need these garrisons on the western frontier. The real question is whether to use the occasional detachments or occasionally use a militia to defend these western frontier lands, or a permanent corps, a permanent military structure through the government. And then Hamilton continues, and I quote, "The first is impracticable, and if practicable would be pernicious. The militia would not long, if at all, submit to be dragged from their occupations and families to perform that most disagreeable duty in time of profound peace." End quote. See, this is the first time that the militia is really mentioned in terms of provisions of the Constitution. And if you notice, the militia, he differentiates the militia from the military, saying the militia is of the nature of regular working class citizens that have jobs, normal people that are not really technically enlisted in the military. They're just regular Americans that are willing to take up arms to fight for their country or their state. Now, the militia in the quote above is described as regular citizens with professions that are separate from that of the military engagement, who take up arms to fight for and with their fellow countrymen. And then he states, and I quote, "And if they could be prevailed upon or compelled to do it, the increased expense of frequent rotation of service and the loss of labor and disconcertation of the industrious pursuits of individuals would form conclusive objections to the scheme. It would be as burdensome and injurious to the public as ruinous to the private citizens." End quote. So he's talking about if these individuals, people that were of the militia, people that were willing to take up arms to defend their country, if they were taken constantly from their job and there was a rotation to go to the western frontier or just to be in the militia for certain extensive time or certain periods of time, you would see the economy suffer because of this, because there'd be a loss of labor in the workforce. And it would also be inconsistent because you're going off one day, you're coming back to run your business, then you're leaving again. and it would jeopardize our commerce in this country. And then he continues, and I quote, "The latter resource of permanent corps in the pay of the government amounts to a standing army in time of peace, a small one indeed, but not the less real for being small. Here is a simple view of the subject that shows us at once the impropriety of a constitutional interdiction of such establishments and the necessity of leaving the matter to the discretion and prudence of the legislature." So here what he's saying is, even though the military, a standing military, may be a small one, it is indeed still a military. It will be much more professional, well-trained than just having a random militia that is consistently switching out forces, almost like when you're watching a hockey game and they're doing a switch-up every single so many, let's say a minute and a half, you're doing a switch-up, guys are getting off the ice, new guys are getting back on the ice. That's what would be going on, and it would cause instability, and there wouldn't be as much uniformity in the system. So he's saying that there's an impropriety or a loss of type of decorum in having a constitutional interception of having the establishments, meaning having no establishments at all. There's going to be just to begin with, it's against constitutional norms, because then he's going to go on to explain I think he explains some other country that, or most governments have some sort of government apparatus, military. So that being said, Hamilton stresses the importance of a standing military as a better alternative defense to the depredations of foreign powers from the Atlantic and those on the western frontier. With one united federal government, Hamilton believed that an army would be more efficacious in terms of funding a larger and more competent force. Then he continues here. And I quote, "In proportion to our increase in strength, it is probable, nay, it may be said certain, that Britain and Spain would augment their military establishments in our neighborhood. If we should not be willing to be exposed in a naked and defenseless condition to their insults and encroachments, we should find it expedient to increase our frontier garrisons in some ratio to the force by which our western settlements might be annoyed." End quote. So what he's saying is we need to increase our garrisons on the eastern seaboard because Britain and Spain, they pose a serious threat to our national security and if they're in our increase in strength, we're going to see Britain and Spain augment their own military establishments to kind of match what's going on with the United States. If a situation would arise, they'd be able to combat and fight the United States. So they're going to also grow their military. As they do that, we should also start to build our eastern seaboard military up with our garrisons or our settlements, I guess you would call them, like our military settlements, just like they are on the western settlements, on the western frontier. So he continues, and I quote, "There are and will be particular posts, the possession of which will include the command of large districts of territory and facilitate future invasions of the remainder. It may be added that some of those posts will be keys to the trade with the Indian nations. Can any man think it would be wise to leave such posts in a situation to be at any instant seized by one or the other of two neighboring and formidable powers? To act this part would be to desert all the usual maxims of prudence and policy." End quote. So he's saying there's going to be a lot of trading going on at these, I guess you would call them ports, or these military territories. There's also going to be regulation of trade in terms of taxation, probably as well, with Native American or Indian nations. So why would we leave them susceptible to an attack from foreign nations as well as the Native American tribes? Because if you're able to cut off a trading post, and let's say we get all of our timber, our lumber from this trading post that's in Georgia in the South, because at that time they were getting a lot of their lumber to build boats in the South. Let's say we were able to shut down the other countries were able to shut down that trading port where we got all of our lumber from. Now, how are we going to fight them when they come to the eastern seaboard and they send their navy or their naval ships over? We have no answer for them in the water to even stop them or create a circle of protection around ourselves. So then he states, Oh, he's saying if states were in charge of this defense to upkeep, the upkeep would be far too expensive and burdening on the state governments, hence the reasoning behind a national military. And then he's going to end this paper with this statement here, and I quote, "If we mean to be commercial people or even to be secure on our Atlantic side, we must endeavor as soon as possible to have a navy. To this purpose there must be dockyards and arsenals, and for the defense of these fortifications and probably garrisons. When a nation has become so powerful by sea that it can protect its dock yards by its fleets, this supersedes the necessity of the garrisons for that purpose. But where naval establishments are in their infancy, moderate garrisons will in all likelihood be found an indispensable security against descents for the destruction of the arsenals and dockyards and sometimes of the fleet itself." So what they're saying is they want to have troops stationed on the Atlantic seafront, as in the eastern seaboard, on that front, because they're worried about imminent attacks coming from Britain or Spain. And until we have a very strong navy, or we have a competent navy, we need to keep those garrisons there to defend our country, defend our trading posts. And until that, and he's saying our naval establishments at this point are in their infancy. They're in the very beginning. They are amateur compared to these other countries that are almost masterful in their naval operations. So that's really it for this one. Please like, share, subscribe if you enjoy the content. Let people know. Drop the mic on people. Let them know Mike D'Amato, that's the name of the podcast. That is the name of me. The podcast, I guess you would call me. The guy that is on the mic. Mike, drop the mic. My name is Michael D'Amato. You can follow me on Twitter. I'll have everything in the description. Twitter, Parler. I'm also on Facebook. Got the Federalist Files Facebook page. Yeah, so please like, share, subscribe, whatever you see. Whenever you see my name pop up, if you like the content, that will help me, disseminate and get my podcast out there, because I'm having issues with advertising right now. I'm unable to advertise anything political. I can sometimes advertise some of these podcasts, but usually they're not as popular as my current event podcast, where I go through things that are going on in the national news. So I greatly appreciate everyone for tuning in. If you are going to be celebrating Christmas today, I hope you have a Merry Christmas, or if you've already celebrated, I hope you had a Merry Christmas. Thank you very much, and I will see everyone. We're going to have a weekend special this weekend, so I'll see everyone this weekend. Thank you.